Acknowledged.
New construction options. Building. Construction complete. New construction options. Building. Construction complete. New construction options. Building. Unit ready.
Waiting affirmative.
Building. Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Affirmative. Very
Unit
well.
ready. Building.
Reporting. Agreed.
Unit ready. Building.
Ready and waiting.
Unit
Very well.
ready. Building. Unit
Agreed.
ready.
Waiting orders. Affirmative.
Building. Unit
Ready and waiting. Very well.
Building. Unit
Waiting
ready.
orders. Very well. Affirmative.
Unit
Very well.
lost.
Affirmative. Very well. Agreed. Affirmative. 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 Very well. Affirmative.
Construction complete.
Ready and waiting. At once. Very well.
Construction options. Building.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative. Agreed. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Unit lost. Building. Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Agreed. Ready and waiting.
Unit ready. Building. Unit ready. Building. Construction complete. New construction options. Building. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Very well. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building.
Ready and waiting. Reporting. Affirmative. At once.
Unit ready. Building.
Orders. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Agreed. Yes, sir. Very well. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Report affirmative. Agreed. Yes, sir.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir.
Construction complete.
Vehicle report. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Unit ready. Construction options. Building.
Waiting order. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
On hold. Cancel.
Echo reporting.
Construction complete. Building.
Yes, sir.
Construction
Waiting
complete.
order. Affirmative. Very well.
Silence needed. Building. Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Comrade.
Unit ready. Building.
Waiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Construction complete. New construction options. Building.
Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Unit ready. Building.
Awaiting orders.
Construction complete. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Waiting for knowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative.
Silos loaded.
Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledge.
ready.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Building.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Awaiting. Acknowledge.
Silos
Affirmative.
loaded. Construction complete.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Cannot deployable. On hold.
Yes.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Unit
Yes.
lost.
Acknowledge.
Building. Primary building
Reporting.
selected.
Yes, sir.
Silos needed.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledge.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Wait. Agreed. Yes, sir.
Unit
Yes, sir.
lost.
Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledge.
ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Acknowledge.
Building.
Yes, sir. Comrade. Vehicle report. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge. Yes. Acknowledge.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Comrade.
Silos needed.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit
Yes, sir.
ready.
Acknowledge.
Building.
Awaiting order. Acknowledge.
Construction complete.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Primary building selected. On hold.
Yes,
Unit
sir.
ready.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building.
Comrade. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Waiting order. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge.
Building.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge.
Building.
Affirmative. 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 Perfect. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
ready.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Reporting.
lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Orders.
Construction
Affirmative.
complete.
Agreed. At once.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge.
Building.
Very
Unit
well. Very well.
lost.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Agreed.
lost.
At once. Affirmative.
Unit
At once.
lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. At
Unit
once.
lost.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Yes, sir.
ready.
Acknowledge.
Unit lost. Building.
Affirmative.
Unit
Waiting or
lost.
affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Waiting. Not perfect.
Unit ready. Reconstruction options. Building.
Not perfect. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building.
Comrade. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Unit lost. Building. Cancel.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit ready. Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes. Acknowledge.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative.
Building. Construction complete.
Yes, affirmative.
Primary building selected. Building.
Comrade. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Yes, affirmative. Perfect. Waiting order.
Silos
Acknowledge.
needed.
Affirmative.
Construction
Affirmative.
complete.
Ready and
Unit
waiting.
lost. Silos needed. Building. Unit lost. Reconstruction options. Unit lost. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Waiting orders. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost. Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost. Building.
Reporting. Affirmative. Waiting for knowledge.
Unit ready. Construction complete. Building. Building. On hold. Cancel. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Reporting. Reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building. Cannot deploy here.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Waiting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Waiting for acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Reporting.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building. Building. Unit ready.
Comrade. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Construction
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Waiting. Affirmative.
Building. Building. Our base is under attack.
Acknowledged. Waiting. Affirmative. Waiting. Acknowledged. Waiting. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction
Yes,
complete.
acknowledged.
Unit ready. Unit lost. Building.
Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building. Building. Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Building. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Report. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Acknowledged. Yes, affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building. Building.
Waiting for affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Construction
Acknowledged.
complete.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Insufficient
Acknowledged.
funds.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
lost.
Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Reporting. At once. Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Construction
Affirmative.
complete.
Acknowledged.
Unit
Yes,
lost.
sir. Acknowledged.
Building. Building.
Reporting. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Construction
Acknowledged.
complete.
Affirmative.
Unit ready. Cannot deploy here. Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting.
lost.
Affirmative. Yes,
Unit
sir.
lost.
Of course. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost. ready.
Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Construction complete. Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Acknowledged.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Comrade. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Comrade. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Waiting. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Insufficient funds.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, acknowledged. Comrade. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Waiting. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Comrade. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged.
On hold. Cancel.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Comrade. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Acknowledged. 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 Waiting
Unit
order.
lost.
Affirmative. Agreed.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Building. Construction complete.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes. Acknowledged.
Primary building selected.
Waiting for acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative.
Unit ready. Unit lost. Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
At one. Area of course. Affirmative. With
Unit
affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Course.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Of course. Reporting.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
Agree at once.
Unit lost.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Waiting for affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Comrade. Acknowledge. sir. Acknowledged. Comrade. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Waiting order.
On hold. Cancel. Construction complete. Building.
Yes, sir. Reporting. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building.
Comrade.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
On hold. Building. Building.
Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building. Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Reporting. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Waiting affirmative. 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 Waiting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, waiting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Comrade. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Very well.
Lost.
Waiting order. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Affirmative. Comrade. Acknowledged.
Insufficient funds. Structure sold.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Yes, affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Vehicle affirmative. Comrade. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Reporting.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Vehicle acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged.
Building. Unit ready.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Construction complete.
Affirmative.
Building. Building.
Yes, sir. Waiting order. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Comrade. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
ready.
Affirmative. Vehicle reported.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Construction complete.
Waiting order. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Yes. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Vehicle reported. Waiting. Affirmative. 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 Yes. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Cannot deploy here. I am present.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes,
Unit
sir.
lost.
Affirmative.
Unit
Very well.
ready. Building. Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Vehicle
ready.
affirmative. Waiting.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit
Yes, sir.
lost.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Building.
Reporting.
Lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
lost.
Awaiting orders.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost. Building.
Affirmative. Waiting order. Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Waiting. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Report. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Waiting for affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative.
Insufficient funds.
Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Building.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Very well. Of course.
Building.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Affirmative. Waiting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Ready and waiting. Agreed. Of course. Report. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Awaiting or affirmative.
Tire curtain ready. Building.
Reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Waiting or reporting. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Reporting. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Building. On hold. Building.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building. Unit ready. Building. Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Building. Unit
Comrade.
ready.
Awaiting orders. Waiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes,
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Comrade.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledged.
Construction
Affirmative.
complete.
Yes,
Unit
sir.
ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged.
Withdrawn. Note down. Other.
Construction options. Unit ready. Building. On hold.
Yes, sir.
Cancel.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Report.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Comrade. Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Reporting.
ready.
Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Waiting. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes,
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Awaiting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready. Building.
Reporting.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Waiting order.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Vehicle reporting.
Reporting.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes,
Affirmative. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Waiting.
Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Awaiting.
Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Reporting.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Acknowledged.
Silence.
Affirmative. Waiting order.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Silos
No problem.
needed.
Acknowledged.
Silos needed. Mission accomplished.